Okay, this is really customer feedback and marketing analysis for this particular meeting. So again, now we have come around the circle and we are at the analyze place. In the original circle, we had two steps in here. One was customer feedback and the other was analyze that. So customer feedback, just because it's not here in a circle doesn't mean it's not important. It's really important. And this is something that people simply forget to do. And so we're gonna go through that process, and this really kind of completes it until we get to the analysis. So the customer feedback loop is really key, and you need to establish and maintain it as rigorously as financial reports. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means systems again. We've talked about systems, and many times people will do a survey and they won't really go anywhere from there. And then 3 years later, they say, gee, we haven't done a survey in a while. Well, this is a part of a continual ongoing program, like so many of the other pieces should be in marketing. And that's one of the things that kind of causes this not to happen very well, is because people don't make it a regular part, place it on the calendar and know you're going to do it in certain cases. So let's go through this a little bit here. First, we've got direct customer feedback. These are the different types of things that you can do. First, you can do customer desk. Well, people call and say you're wonderful, but most of the time they call and say you screwed up my order again, or I don't like the quality, or whatever the complaint may be. This is an important step. And normally people just sit on the phone and they don't really want to talk about this. They don't really want people to know what's happened. But good companies will make sure that every inbound call from a customer has a little bit of a notation or a checklist just to say, yes, this guy is great. But when there's a complaint, you gotta take it down. And at the dairy, we do this with, I would say a record of about 30 to 40 every day. So every weekly report will have 100 to 300 notations on there. And because of the number of contacts that are not all complaints, but because of the number of contacts, we also have them put a category so that you kind of check a little box, and then you've got an opportunity to go through and take a little bit closer look at individual problems. The sales team, we need to have a formal and informal comments and sort of discussion place to record this. For most people who run companies, you have to go back to the sales team and keep pushing and train your salespeople to do this. In other words, when they have a touch with a customer, different companies are different. If you're selling $1 million worth of stuff at one time, you're not going to have more than a few customers. Sometimes the long lead time, really before they get to a customer, sometimes that will take the form of ongoing discussions. But in this particular case, it's so important to be able to hear the kinds of trends and how they are changing over time. And of course, customer surveys. This is really something that is common that people will do. And today, boy, it is so easy to do this with Surveymonkey and 2 or 3 other survey companies that can do this. It's very inexpensive. You can build your own surveys. It's not as though surveys don't need some understanding of how to build good ones. That comes with time. However, many times they'll actually help you construct those and give you the logic for how to go about and build certain kinds of questions. So it's a very learnable skill, and it's very easy to be able to look at the analysis at the end because they do all the work for you. So there's no excuse like there used to be not to do regular customer surveys. With one client, we set it up so that they would do a major survey every 3 years, because there are a lot of, it used to take us a long, long time to be able to go through and do this when we did paper ones, and we'd send out thousands and thousands of them and get hundreds of them back. And we go through and we put all the answers into, a computer, and we build them. Well, we don't do any of that now, but it turns out that having a 3-year cycle is a good time period. But there are other things that need to be done too. So in addition, there are product launches that you want to survey on, feedback survey on just a particular product. There are issues you have with customer service that need to be resolved. If you have a lot of complaints, you might want to send out a survey for that. There are times when you need to isolate these and do it geographically, or do it by customer type, or by sort of persona type, in order to be able to dig into problems. But boy, there's just no reason not to be able to not to do surveys. So there's also the opportunity to do it immediately after a product is delivered, so that you can get that immediate, how did you like it? Were you delighted with the service, etc. And then there's online feedback, and these come in a couple of different ways. A Yelp score is interesting. Of course, you get the actual comment. You have an opportunity to be able to respond to that. And if you end up with a business in an industry where everybody's got a 5 and you've got a 3, that is not going to help your business. There are a group of people, a lot of people, poo-poo this and say, nah, we don't really care about the Yelp score. That doesn't have anything to do with us. Or they say it's only the weirdos, it couldn't have been helped, all of that stuff. Yeah, but there are a certain number of customers that use Yelp on a continual basis to check out, whether or not there have been complaints about your company. And in that particular case with that group of people, that's very important. And so certain businesses need to make sure that their Yelp score is as high as they can make it, period. And that ends up, requiring 2 or 3 initiatives in order to get that to go better. The other problem is, if you start out poorly, man, it is hard to get that thing to go up, because you have to overcome all those people who left you a bad score and try and replace them with better scores. So the Yelp, a lot of business owners don't like it, but it is becoming more and more important, I believe, over time. And there are bunches of other ones too. Consumer reports, that happens to be a specific one called Consumer Reports. I use it all the time to evaluate products. So you want to be able to have your particularly, physical products. You want to have your physical products tested. There are lots of other places that do this, UL Labs, et cetera, where you can get sort of certifications. But the point is, you're going to need to be building products and services that can stand up to quality, reliability, and depending on the product, quietness, et cetera, so that you can compete favorably. If you can't compete favorably within customer in something like Consumer Reports, that just tells you got a crappy product and you need to do something about it. You may have people looking at it, but I will tell you that I use Consumer Reports on a continual basis to buy appliances for rentals, sometimes to select service people to work on rentals. I certainly do that for large purchases myself. Computers, they're changing all the time, quality changes. And so I utilize that to make, almost all large purchases, including cars. So that is important, and it's one of those online feedback tools. Product blogs. This is a way that you can look at other people's blogs. It's easy to look at a blog based on an industry or a product. And so you simply do some searches, you find the people who are involved in talking about your kind of business, your kind of product area or market, and you watch those to see if they have something to say. Also, it's a great place to submit your product and say, would you do an evaluation or do a little blog on it? And then, of course, there are those who take money to do that. So that ends up becoming a sort of an online tool, advertising tool as well. And then, of course, social media is a great place to get a lot of feedback. The problem is that very few, small companies really do have a good, a reasonable number of people on their company Facebook. And so you're not really going to get a whole lot of input necessarily. You always get the few guys that are upset. They're going to leave a really nasty note. And then for every 10 or 12 or 20 people who really like it, they might like a particular post, and they might friend you, but it's hard. Give you an example of the dairy with 30,000 customers. I think we have 2,000 to 3,000 followers or friends, and we probably have a comment every I'd say maybe 2 comments a week. We do very limited postings on there, but it is a good place to find out what's going on. Also, one of the social medias, which is kind of interesting, it's hard to figure out, is Nextdoor. Now that's a closed one based on where you live, and you probably know about it. But if you have a market that only has a few neighborhoods, that's a good way. Try and find friends that have access to certain ones and have them feed you back information about what people are saying among themselves. Boy, if something happens really bad, sour milk or glass in a bottle, and lots of other different things for different industries, this can spread like wildfire, and you need to figure out what's going on. Now, it's part of the reason that the customer desk complaints are so critical is because you got to keep track of who's making the call, what their neighborhood is, or what industry they're in. You've got to be able to record that so you can figure out when you have a pattern of a problem that you can zoom in on it, and you can fix that by sending out customer surveys immediately just to that target group of people. So that's an important part in order to get your customer feedback to work. Customer transaction data, we talked a little bit about this when we went into customer analyzation, the first thing around our marketing cycle. That particular transaction data is really important to look at from just about every way you possibly can. So, of course, you're going to accumulate that data, and you're going to do analysis on that data. So it gives you things like how much purchasing is done by how many customers. What about the 80-20 rule? We've talked about that a few times. Are your best customers the ones that are giving you the right margins? Is the pace of purchasing changing? Is it going up generally or going down generally? So all of these questions and analysis can be done in the customer group, like a cohort group. Determine if different cohort groups have different circumstances or different responses. With the dairy, again, using that as an example because we have tons and tons and tons of data from them. In that particular case, when we offered brand new products, I recently went into a variety of meats and just a whole new category of products. We wanted to know what's going on, and so we could dig down and take a look at their cohort, the mosaic code cohort groups, and find out who they were. When we had the 30% increase during COVID, and we were just breaking the wheels off the trucks, we were able to go through and do an entire analysis on all 30,000 customers and sort those into by average purchase per week for the weeks in March and February versus March versus April, et cetera. And so we could take a look at those and see where they are, and then accumulate them based on their mosaic code, the type of customer it was, and then really do an incredible analysis to tell us exactly who they were. And so we discovered, and it wasn't a surprise, but we had to verify, we discovered that it was the high income neighborhoods and the people who like to try new things and do new things, the ones who are not so worried about cost, that increased. And so because we had a 30% increase across the entire company, it was interesting to note that we had a 50 to 200% increase among the top 10 to 15% of the customers who happened to fall in just 3 or 4 cohort groups. Wow, how important is that? I mean, really, that is key information. There's no reason to spend time and money to try and get people who will never buy steaks or who will never increase their business by 30% due to a budget when you know that it's a certain group of people that are going to do that. I'm happy to say that we watch that now every week, and we're able to determine and look at our weekly averages so that we can see where that's going. Fortunately, it is still 15% ahead of last year. So things are going very nicely for that particular business. Sales stats we just talked about, but there are all kinds of other statistics that you may want to get that would be relevant to each individual business. And then, of course, frequency. How often do you purchase things? And is it slowing down? Are we ready to see a change in that? And then occasionally there are companies that have seasonal buying trends. Fashion companies are highly seasonal, and you want to know if things are not going well, say this quarter compared to last quarter, because you made a yeah. And finally, product. So when we get into product,
can't you measure?
Yeah. Is that a question? Question? Okay. So of course, product analysis, you do this whole thing by products, and then you compare them to the individual customer groups, cohorts, etc. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the customer journey and when this happens. I don't think we've actually talked about the customer journey. It used to be that there was a nice little pyramid. John and I did a nice paper on this, kind of a white paper. Let me know if you'd like to have it, but it talks about the difference in customer buying habits today. And when we used to look at these, they were all based on a pyramid. And, it's like prospecting. How many people come in the top of the funnel and how many people are left? And, finally you get down to the bottom and they're the small percentage that actually buy. Well, that model is not really useful anymore. We're finding it's much more of a circle. So what happens is that if you have you've got somebody coming in to take a look at you. By that I'm talking about maybe they're looking at your window or maybe they're looking online. What happens as they kind of consider where they're going and what they're doing going towards the purchase. So you've got the need, the desire, internet, social, what their educational level is, or whether they need to learn more about the product if it's a very tough product. Brand reputation. Fine, you start doing a comparison, and then you get to the decision stage. The interesting thing here, just a little bit aside, is that somewhere, they're on the internet up in here, and somewhere about here, they begin to get ready to try and figure out how to call a rep or go online to buy it or whatever the closing is for each industry. And so when somebody makes a phone call, the average person has already made their decision. About 85% of their decision is made. And I think we've talked briefly about this. So salespeople need to be retrained, not to go through and tell the same old thing. I had a call today because I was interested in a fractal purchase of a second home. very interested in this concept. So I called, he asked me the qualifying questions and then immediately said, great, I'm going to put you in touch with your guy. And, within an hour, I had a call from the guy who would be my particular rep, who would be the one who would tell me how all of this works, how you can access it as a buyer, how you can sell out, what your percentages are, all that stuff. They really understood what I had already known because of the previous conversation, because I had, I'd signed a form, and they knew that I had done a certain amount of research online already. So some of these new companies have got this figured out. But the old line companies and the older salespeople, they'd start at the beginning and they want to tell you their story. And I don't want to hear the story because I'd already spent an hour done research. I had listened to a 15-minute clip on Bloomberg 2 times in order to hear the pitch. I was pretty much ready to move on to the next step. So that was done very well. But you have to access people where they are. So once they make a purchase, what happens is that there's still more, and that is that they're evaluating how did that go? Is it easy? Did the delivery happen on time? Was the quality what I expected? And so you've got all kinds of post service. Some things require post service and other things don't. So when I just put in my tankless heater the other day, I kind of expect people to show up and say, hey, is your hot water actually working? But didn't really get very much of that. So now I'm thinking, man, the next time I need one, I may look around again. I'm not completely convinced. If I was convinced and I see that there's continued value, then I'm going to be on a loyalty loop. I'm not going to be in this active evaluation. And so our responses have to be different here. Well, each one of these pieces may be part of a feedback system because you're going to get certain touches. You may get a touch on the internet. If you have a sophisticated system, you may see somebody coming onto your website. You might be able to identify them asking questions on social. You might fill out a form somewhere here. So you're collecting information that's going to turn into purchase and customer information that would be part of your system. And so then the question is, was it really a fun experience? So here's one place you would have a survey. Then you might also survey them if they don't come back to find out what they decided to do, if you have access to the information about them. Of course, you might catch them on the internet and have them fill something out part of the way through the process. And of course, social media, as I mentioned, you can pick up things that you didn't really like. And you can determine if your brand reputation is moving the right direction. So these are all important things. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about sort of some of the more technical, not totally technical, but some of the details about collecting this data, because it does require some technical understanding. So under your direct customer feedback, customer service desk, the complaints and kudos, as I mentioned, so these are all the same things that we've discussed, but each one of these needs to go into a customer database. And once it's in the customer database, it's got to come out of the customer database so that you can do trend reporting, external comparisons to competitors and products and market evaluations, product movement, reputation management, and many other things. Coming up with a database that's flexible enough to be able to collect all of this stuff is very hard to do, if not impossible. Even systems that are supposedly built to do everything, some of the big systems I'm talking about, even for, say, manufacturers, you'll find that they're weak in customer stuff. And so you're going to have to figure out ways to feed that into, and for the most part, You've got to be able to take bits and pieces of customer data and combine them with sales data and other information in order to get a full picture. It takes time, effort, and people who know how to do that, unfortunately. For smaller companies, though, you can put this information together more easily, especially if you group it by cohort data. That way you'll be able to, apply certain statistics to different pieces of it and get what you need, but it almost always needs a little bit of manipulation. Start by asking the question, what do we need to know about the customer? And then kind of work backwards. Say, we need to have a certain amount of this information, et cetera. One of the things, though, that is always true, and that is that data comes in to your office and it sits on your table, sometimes for a second and sometimes for a little bit longer, and it falls off the desk on the other side. It's in other words, data is brought in and out of a business and it just goes away. And that's because you're not capturing it in a logical, straightforward way. Small companies can do these with small systems, relatively easy. An old system that I've used called Commence can be built to capture anything about your customers that you would like to do. There are lots of other systems that have different pieces to that. Building your own database, unless you're pretty good at it, can also be a little bit of a time waster if you're not careful about how you do it and you don't know exactly what you're doing. So that's kind of a tough decision and you need to have a lot of consideration. So, okay. So data is really great, but data over time is fabulous. So if this is your data today, the way you're going to enhance your data is by having it over a period of time. And so these are not really categories. This is really this year, the year before, et cetera. In other words, utilizing that data. So I mentioned that we've been doing it. We have a survey that we do about every 3 years with the dairy. That particular data has been accumulated since 1991 or so. And so we literally have 30 to 35 years of data that has been utilized across time in order to be able to determine if we're going forward or going backwards on any given issue. So you might think, well, gee, that's a lot of data. Why would you do it? It's like, well, why wouldn't you save it? Disk space is cheap nowadays. Some of those, of course, were paper, and we literally went back and we utilized the paper ones and we took the results and we put them back into a computer so we could do a comparison. And so we now have comparisons on about 30 or 40 questions. Now, the interesting thing is that you have to be really careful about doing a major survey because you don't want to change the questions all the time. So these are fairly basic things, 4 or 5 or 6 elements on service, 3 or 4 elements on product quality, 2 or 3 elements on image, maybe 4 or 5 different questions to get at the same answer on, are we doing a good job? One of the questions we always ask is, how many people have you referred to us in the last year? Sort of a quantitative number. And then at the same time, we will ask in another place so that they don't know that it's being asked. It's not the same question. We'll ask things like, have you ever had a conversation with your neighbor about us? And 2 or 3 things. And then we use a composite of 3 or 4 questions there in order to be able to score to see whether or not we have developed loyalty. It's all a loyalty. It's a set of loyalty questions. And it has been so useful. And we have found that by applying this over years, we've gotten better and better and better. So in customer service, we used to have a sort of a cumulative score it's a step score between 1 and 7. And, we would find we got some 7s and a lot of 6s and a lot of 5s and then some 4s, 3s, 2s. So we were pretty pleased with that. But the cumulative score actually dropped during a period of time, say about 6 years, 7 years in. It's gone up since then. But what we found out in short order, well, it wasn't short order because we did it every 3 years. What we found out is that we had dropped in specifically in customer service 2 or 3 or 4 questions having to do with that. And it had happened between the last 3-year period and the current 3-year period, and we were wondering what happened. So we began to dig into that. And because the owners took that seriously, we sort of doubled up our efforts to make sure that everybody was doing the right thing. They found that there was one single person who was not there 3 years ago, who is there today, that was not treating customers very well, not terribly, not poorly enough to know that, to be just obvious. They get rid of those people right away, but just enough to kind of piss people off just a little bit. And so over time, we didn't really notice it, but it showed up in this survey because we dropped for the first time on our index. When they figured that out, they fired her. And that went away. So we did one 6 months later, just on service, and that went away within 6 months. It was isolated to a single person. They typically have about 8 in the customer service department, and a single person was making that much difference. We could go back through after we found out about it. We went back through and we found out there were associated quits with that person. So it pays. It actually pays for the time and effort it takes to do it. Okay, so analysis. Now we're on our home stretch. We don't have a lot to say about analysis, but basically you use your analysis from all of this information from the feedback systems that you put together, and you obviously make adjustments, and of course we're talking about to the marketing planning cycle. It's that without the adjustments, why do it? So what we have is we've gone through this entire process, through all of these pieces, and we've come around and we've done the analyzation, and now we're ready to start again, but we've got to make changes. So you begin to make changes somewhere in here. As you begin to see and measure, now it doesn't mean you can't do it other times, but you come back around and you say, okay, now we've done all of this work. We've looked at the feedback. We've done a full campaign. So that could be over a period of years, or it could be just a month. We've done a full campaign. Now we've got the information, the feedback from the customers. Now we've done the analysis, and now we're ready to go back and say, you know what? It is time for us to make some changes. We're going to change how we treat our customers. We're going to increase our service there. We're going to increase, we see that our product isn't quite as good as it should be. We've got to increase our quality compared to our competition. We got to make sure that we still have the competencies that we have. In some cases, we have noticed that certain services that were no longer offered were mentioned. It's like, well, how important is that? We better get back on these competencies and add them to what we're doing. It helps us retarget because we find out there are some customers we just can't satisfy at any price. Just had a recent conversation because with one client, the orders have increased in 3 months, have increased about 50 or 60%. Now, we did this with the dairy too, so now it's happening a second time. And of course, I only have 2 customers that I pay attention to anymore. And so now what's happened though is that we're talking about millions of dollars. And when we take a look at production, we've got some sort of a bottleneck. And we know that our production is limited to what we can produce. So we've got to figure that out. So we are, in terms of targeting and production, that's an issue, we've got to work on that. In terms of targeting, as we're having conversations with someone about a new estimate or, what the job entails, what machine would it go on? Now we can ask the questions, when do we have capacity? And we can go back to them and say, we can't produce this at this price right now, but we can commit to it at this price in December. Or we just say, we're not going to do it until December or January. If you need it now, it is too short of an order for us to make money on this price. But if you want to pay more for setup, then we can squeeze this in before that. It gives us a whole new opportunity to think through how we're going to accept orders. And so that is pretty nice. So those are the kinds of adjustments that you make. You also do things to look at your campaign. Don't forget, you need to analyze where your business came from, sort of go backwards. You got new customers, you analyze that. Did it come from one media or another media? Did this content work or another piece of content work? Do we position it correctly? So each one of these things can be reevaluated and slightly tweaked for the next go around. And that's how the marketing planning cycle works. And that's why it works, is because by itself, it's a complete feedback loop. So there we are. That's a little bit shorter than we normally do, but I wanted to go through that and make sure that we covered that. And so what kind of questions do you have at this point? We'll be happy to take some questions. Any questions or comments? Okay, then,
Hi, Ron.
yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I have a question. How are you distributing the surveys, or how are you doing this through paper or through some type of digital media?
Yeah, we're doing it always, and so the way you kind of consider that is, who's your customer? What are they likely to do? Respond to? We do know that paper surveys don't do as well as they used to, and the reason is that you have to put them, you got to mark them all up and then put them back in an envelope and send them. So from that standpoint, the responses are much smaller. So that's one way. And there are times when doing paper surveys probably still makes sense. For instance, if you have a group of customers that are, I'll say 55 or 60 and up, the chances of them responding to an online survey are pretty tough. The other thing that happens is, can you even get to them in time? So when you've got a group of people who look at their email once a week, and you need to get the responses back, in a few days, you may not even get them. They may completely ignore an email. And so there are times when doing a paper survey still makes sense. But for the most part, these can be done on a website, right on a page that they've already shown interest in, or via email. That's one of the big reasons to have an email and permission to email them. Good customers are happy to get an email occasionally. You don't want to overdo surveying any more than you want to overdo advertising via email or text or any other media. So nowadays you can do these inside of social media platforms as well. So there are lots of ways to do these surveys. But don't forget, if you have people on the phone, when you're having a conversation, you're really kind of doing a survey, aren't you? So you want to build your customer service responses so that you've got a little checklist, either on the computer or on paper, and you're going to go through that and, did you cover this? Yes. Ask them about this. Did they bring this up? And so you build that so that you can do it just while you're talking. So there are a lot of ways to do that, and all ways are good. And continuing to test and see what works and what doesn't work, meaning that you're going to say, we sent out X number, we got X number of responses, etc. Now, having said all of that, one of the problems is getting a statistical sample. So, we haven't talked about, statistical samples at all. But you need to be able to have enough people to represent your customers in a reasonable fashion. And so there are 2 or 3 ways to do that. If you have an interest, that might be something that we could talk about more. SurveyMonkey has a terrific tool. I mean, I just love it. You can go through that and calculate how many people you need to get a statistical sample. And so if you've got 300 people, you might say, gee, I don't know if that's a big enough sample. Well, if you've got 400 customers, that's a big enough sample. If you've got 30,000 customers, you send it out to 300 and you only get back 87. 87 is probably not a statistical sample. So you got to ask yourself, what did you do? Why did you do it? Now, on the other hand, we might pick a certain route and send out an email to everybody on that route, maybe 150 people. And if you get 30 back, you got a statistical sample. It's actually, when you have a stratified group, you can get a pretty good reliability on a sample with a relatively small number of people, as small as 12, 15 sometimes. So it can be much smaller than you might think of at first. And then you also have to ask yourself, well, do I need to have a level of confidence of 3%? No, not on most questions. If you're gonna invest $1 million to build a new product, and you're trying to test whether or not it makes sense, yeah, you'd like to have a pretty good confidence on that. So sure, you want to have a big enough sample to get the right answer, But if you're developing a new product that you spend a week or 2 weeks doing, and your cost is a few $1,000s, and you think that people might use it because they've said they're open to it, yeah, chances are give that a try anyway. But the more important part is, how much did you sell? Okay, so I mean, it's important to keep track of the sales. You have a new product, you launched it, how much did you sell? Then how many customers bought it? Which customers are those that bought it? And what did those customers say about it? Why did the customers not buy it? And why did the customers who bought it liked it? Because you can use that as copy to get the rest of the customers to decide that they ought to try it. So it's a great tool. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can use this stuff. But if you don't ask the questions, if you're not gathering the information, then you're another one of those companies that has all the data going across the table and falling on the floor into the wastebasket, which doesn't make any sense. Although every company does it, every company loses data. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a term flying around. I'm hearing more so of called they're calling it database reactivation, so to speak. So I guess they have a stale customer list and trying to reactivate that and trying to re-engage and let them know, hey, I got a special, or so a survey at that point might be a good idea, just to kind of get some engagement from your current existing base, right?
Yeah. Actually, that should be part of a sales cycle. If you're just kind of occasionally thinking about, well, we need to reactivate some people on our database, and how do we get that done? Then you've already done something wrong. You've already screwed up, because you should have every former customer on a customer track. And they should have their communications should be built just to them. So, when you go back and you take a look at that, just think about that cycle, along with the customer journey cycle. As soon as they come off of that cycle, you're going to initiate follow-up specifically so that it doesn't have to be reactivated. I mean, until they buy again, in some businesses, they're not a customer until they buy again. But they do have a certain amount of loyalty. You're going to have a better opportunity to get them to come back and buy. In fact, they have that old number, and I don't doubt it at all, and that is it costs 5 times more to get a new customer than it does to sell a customer again. So why would you spend a whole 5 times the money to go out and find a new customer when you've already got a bunch of customers in your database?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you don't ever want to get to the point to where you have to quote reactivate. That means you screwed up from the start.
Yeah, I agree. I see it as a needed service that everybody, a lot of business owners are in that predicament. Is they never really, they have the customer list scattered,
Yeah.
not in one central database. They might be in emails or spreadsheets, and that service alone is a value to a marketer or a business consultant that could come in and help, some, dinosaur, say real estate broker that's trying to capture, more business and get up, to date with showing a presence online. I see that a lot with them they're just struggling, trying to figure out how to get new customers but they're not paying attention to their old database. And I think that they can squeeze out a lot more from that before having to spend money, like you said, on new customers.
Oh yeah, and so many times I used to go in, and that's where we'd start. That'd be the very first thing, because you find out that the company, the only way the company has a record of any of their customers is because they had to invoice them, and so now their information, hopefully they've got an email, but their information is stuck in their accounting system, for crying out loud. Now that's not inherently a problem unless you don't use it because it's so difficult to get, or you print out a list and you don't do anything with it. But the issue then is, well, okay, we need to set up intervals on, say, a weekly or monthly basis to have those downloaded and put into another program, unless the accounting system has some tools within it. But for the most part, you're absolutely right. They start with, well, we don't know who they are. Restaurants are particularly a problem because, well, a lot of people don't want restaurants to have their emails because they're afraid of what they'll do with them. And so what happens is that you go in, you have a transaction, you pay your money, and you're like anonymous. You go sit down, they love you, they come in every week to eat again, and you don't know who they are. So you can capture that in various different ways. Having a loyalty program is the best way to do that, by saying, gee, we've noticed you're in here. We've got this loyalty card. We're going to give you a discount every time you come in. All you have to do is just give us your name and your email, and we won't bug you too much, but we'd certainly like to know who you are. And then what you have to do is you have to be able to associate that in the cash register, so that every time that person comes in, then you associate that the transaction with that particular person. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that by giving them, they use the card in order to be able to have a discount. So CVS does this, and hundreds of big stores do this. Thousands of big stores do it. And so you go in and they say, gee, do you have a discount with us? Well, it's just your telephone number, which is perfect, because all that you're doing is you're giving them some record to associate with the sale. Well, it's brilliant. So now they know everything I buy if I want a discount. Now, I don't use discount cards for that reason. The discount at CVS is like 0.5%, or, they give it to you in a variety of ways, and on this real long thing, they print out about 2 feet of tape on your every sale. They give you all these discounts and all this crap. It is unbelievable. So it's amazing how people will respond positively with a very small discount. And sometimes it's not even monetary. It's just, special service, or, a group of coupons or whatever. But yeah, you have to find a way to do that, because then you can identify the different patterns in this customer group. But you're absolutely right. That is the starting problem, is how do we get all of our customers in one place so we can actually do something? How are we going to put the data, attach the data to it at a customer level so that we can utilize that? It's a problem. And I would say it's the number one problem that I've been dealing with for some 30 years, actually. And it's much better today. The part of the reason I left the company that I was with is that I had built a system and we went out and we were very successful with it. I sold 10 of them for $55,000 each, I think it was. I mean, it was a crazy number. Even in those days, it was just a crazy number. And so I came back, and it scared the heck out of the company, because they knew it was going to put, if they sold too many of these, it would put their service bureau business out of business. And of course, service bureaus were already had an end of life coming. That was no surprise to anyone that people would stop using computer service bureaus. But part of what I wanted to do was to add a module that would allow, for the first time, a specific customer to be assigned to the actual sale in a retail store. I thought it was brilliant. And the reason I thought it was brilliant is for all these things we just talked about. But I couldn't sell that to my own company. I couldn't allow them. We'd spent $3 million on this system, and it was really good for the money. In fact, it was one of the best systems at the time there was in the whole country. It didn't matter how much it cost, but they wouldn't let me do that because they were just so down on this system as a whole. They thought it was too powerful. Well, it was powerful. It was incredibly powerful. They missed it. They didn't understand that people have to be able to record their customers and the information about the customers. So when I left, the first thing I did was start thinking about how could I build that myself. Well, it was going to cost more money than I had by about 300 times. And so I didn't end up doing that. I ended up doing building a practice based on customer relationship management. And so this is sort of like the core of how I started independently is helping customers do that. So over a period of, all these years, I've probably helped people, from starting by buying a PC and putting Excel on it to building databases and putting on whole systems. And of course, the whole CRM thing is a big deal. And Salesforce is a huge deal, which started like 20 years after I had my idea to do that. It's now everybody understands that it's something that we should do, but for small customers, they still can't do it very easily. So it is a big problem that still needs a solution. And that's the kind of thing you guys can do for your restaurant stores clients.
Absolutely. We're implementing some automation that is going to shoot off not a survey, but it's more so of leaving a review for every customer that buys, transacts. So it's going to shoot them off either an email, or if we can get their, trying to get it through SMS.
Oh, yeah.
So if we can get them to opt in through SMS, then that's even better because we got the cell phone. But either way, we're trying to shoot off just so they can start to leave reviews. But the survey, I think this is some instances in there where it could be useful for a meal prep client that I have right now that is trying to figure out what menu should be. She's retoggling around her menu and what she's offering, and I figured a survey might be a good way to kind of get some data from her existing customers to figure out what.
Yeah. There's another way too, and that is to simply look at her data, which she doesn't have. But the data would be simply what was the meal and how many burritos have I sold and how many taquitos have I sold, and you take a look at that and you do a trend analysis over time. It's like, okay, that data is should already be there, but I'll bet that they put it in the register and they don't necessarily hit a product code. They just put in the dollars.
So we have our back end has the ability, I don't know if it tracks, and it's a good point. I'm going to see if it tracks the actual items of bringing that data and exporting it. We do have the customer list and the transaction, the ticket amount, but I'm interested to see if it could actually pull the items so that way we could, figure out what the best selling product is.
Right. And of course, if you look closely at the big restaurants, say McDonald's, they're not even putting dollars and cents in. All they're doing is pressing a button that's got a little picture on it that shows the person who's doing the checkout. It shows them the meal, and they push Happy Meal or they push quarter pounder, and the money is irrelevant to the cashier until she gets the total. But what's really happening is that they're not only evaluating how many Happy Meals they're selling, they're evaluating how many they're selling per hour, on what day, based on what promotion, actually pushed that. They're literally looking at everything that you can imagine, and that's because they have got their products oriented around the customer. Now, in that particular case, they've chosen not to try and deal with customers. That would be an interesting discussion to find out why they haven't done that. But and they don't have a discount program that I'm aware of. But they do they do lots of surveys to identify who's in their store, and they may have ways of doing that where it can help them associate it. But for the most part, somebody who walks into McDonald's, they know that they have a certain mix of customers, and they have somewhat of a limited menu that's been pretty much the same for a long time. And so, you kind of have to say, well, do they really need to know the nuances of the customers, or, do they already have that information? We just need to know what products are being sold. And if we that'll help us identify what products we might be able to test. And then they'll do testing in New Zealand, where they have a homogeneous group of people to do the testing, which John Mills always tells me that's what New Zealand does well, or one of the things New Zealand does well is to do this testing. And so they get that all done, and then they just take a look at the particular meals that they sell, and they've got a really good idea of what's going to happen. I'll bet their projections are within a single digit on any given product on any given day.
Wow.
Yeah, they're really, really good. So that's what your restaurant customers have to go against.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things that, Ron, you mentioned New Zealand, and I woke up from my deep sleep.
That's why I did that.
Yeah, I know. But what's interesting is it has such a wide cross-reference of people from Asian countries and Slav countries. So it's really got a very large demographic portfolio that it does represent probably 2/3 of the world.
Oh,
that's why it's kind of cool.
Yeah. So they may utilize that to actually look at the ethnicity behind the people as well, huh?
Yeah, so, and it is, because New Zealand is multicultural, but we pretty much don't have any stigma with a lot of the same stigmas that perhaps other countries would have, because it's a small population, and most of the people who have ended up in New Zealand are slightly higher educated than the average. So it's a pre-qualified group of people,
Yeah.
which is, yeah.
Which turns out to be a good sample test that they can probably adjust adjust each country based on what they get, because they already know that if Asians in New Zealand have a certain buying pattern, they probably know that if they take it to Australia or even China, that they're going to get more of the same thing. They've probably already figured that out.
So David, you probably don't remember the calling cards you used to buy when you had landlines, and somewhere along the line in the 80s and 90s, they came along with, you could put in these digits and you'd be able to call it 3 cents a minute or whatever. That was pioneered by AT&T over there. And then they went to the swipe cards. That was pioneered over there, 40 years ago. The one that really blew me away was McCafe, because in 1990, in Auckland Airport, there was a McCafe there. It looks pretty much similar to the McCafes we've got here today that didn't really come out until 10 years ago. And they were 20 years ahead of that movement, coming up with a coffee experience and dropping the kids experience.
Wow. Yeah. So are they really slow, or did they come to the conclusion that it needed to have a few years of maturity before the markets were ready for it?
Yeah, I think that's what the conclusion was, that the market was a good one and the tangent to get to it was good. However, there had to be a change in something. So that's why they took it carefully. If you have a look here in the US, though, they did roll it out in certain demographic neighborhoods before they did in the general population.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah, they've been really good at doing that kind of thing, and they've just done a wonderful job at that, which is what makes them such a good company and a tough competitor and a good investment in terms of buying stocks. And
yeah,
so, David, that's kind of an interesting, I mean, that kind of says, here's one of the measuring sticks. You're not gonna go to a local taqueria necessarily and say we got to compete with McDonald's. But what you can do is just kind of say, okay, what is it that they do? By understanding what they do, you can help figure out what you need to do, even though it's going to be greatly reduced, greatly simplified for your particular client. But that's the kind of product development that you kind of can shoot for, knowing you got to go that direction. Can you imagine? You can give me a small percentage of this. Can you imagine if you had 30 or 40 restaurants that you looked about the same product mix, same customer mix, and even if it was just spread throughout the Inland Empire? Can you imagine what the accumulated data for those restaurants would be worth?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now you're talking about really helping people. It's because you are feeding back information. So the company that I mentioned, they had two divisions. One was the inventory management system, which I finished building. The other product, which is their major product, they called it merchandise planning, but it's basically a forecasting system for buying goods for the specific store in a certain category, like say men's shirts. So the question would be then, well, how do you get the information to be able to do that? And the answer is, well, we got 2,000 stores around the country, and you understand the seasonality for men's shirts, short sleeve, long sleeve, various kinds of shirts. And it doesn't take too much thought to realize that the season for short sleeve men's dress shirts in Milwaukee is going to be different than the season in Southern California or Hawaii, right? Not too difficult. The question is, well, how exactly does that work? So literally they would go through and they would take a look at all of the sales. Now this is just sales per month, but for each of these categories, like a stratified sample. So they would go through that and they would take a look at the sales that were achieved and the percentages of sales that were achieved given their what they called annual rate. And that was sort of a moving rate of annualized sales. And then by taking a look at the percentages, they could calculate the exact season. And so they would know that if you had X amount of inventory and you sold a certain number of short sleeve shirts in Los Angeles in April, then they would build that, and it would be more for March and more for May, more for June, et cetera. They would build that all the way around. So now you've got 100%, but it's going up and down dramatically based on the season. Then they would do the same thing for Milwaukee, and they would identify. And so in that particular case, you're not going to sell any short sleeve shirts until May, maybe April, but it's going to be April, May, June. And you're going to start, closing those out by the middle or the end of July, because you got to be out of them by August. And so you would literally go zero, you would build it up to 40% in 1 month, back down to zero. And so most seasons are kind of like that. And so you build a season for short sleeve, for long sleeve, for crew neck, for turtleneck, and then you apply that to ski areas versus resort areas versus, urban areas versus suburban areas. And we literally pulled enough data together, and they called that factoring, so that a brand new store that that's going to open up in Tennessee, in Nashville, a brand new store shows up, they feed their annual sales per category. Maybe they don't even have that, so we could collect that data. But over time, then we would apply the factors adjusted for their seasonality, their complete situation, and their sales volume in that category, and we would build them a plan that would plan out 8 months in advance. And then it's altered based, so you'd say, okay, we think you're going to do $20,000 of business this month. If it comes in at $20,000 in business, you go, yeah, we did it. But if it comes in at 10, then we're thinking, there's something wrong. We had the wrong mix. You didn't buy enough. The inventory was too low. Something's happened to your customer traffic, et cetera. Then the second thing that they did is they took a look at the markdowns, because selling something at a markdown is a whole different notion than selling it at full price. And so if somebody took a markdown, they wouldn't buy back into too much more inventory. They would cut their inventory down because the markdowns were higher than the regular threshold that had been planned in. So you see, in a strange way, they were building this interesting and integral customer information without attaching it to a name, but based just on trends, because they had that information. And then when we had 2,000 of them across the country, we were unbelievably powerful because we are the only ones that had that information. And so I remember very specifically when Levi's called, and the guy was, this was in Riverside, Levi called and they needed to have they wanted some information from specialty stores. They couldn't get it anywhere. Everybody had left the office. And I was sort of like the ranking guy that was still there at 5:30. And so I got the call from whoever was his contact. And so we sit down in the office and we begin to walk through this thing. And so I spent about an hour with him explaining how we get our information and what does it really mean and how many stores we had and how many, in this case, they were interested in jeans. They knew a lot about jeans, but they were specifically interested in other sportswear. They're just moving into shirts and other, like chinos and t-shirts and, other kinds of fashion trends, and they had no place to gather the data. And so we sold that report to them for $60,000. So it's obviously worth something, right? So they understand what you could do with the information. They just couldn't get it. And so we just supplied them. We just did an extra run and we showed them the trends across all of our stores collectively for what the markdowns were, what the categories were, how many dollars are going through there. And they were happy to pay us $5,000 a month. And it took us about 10 minutes to run and put in the mail in those days. So
Wow.
that's what information is about. That's what it's worth. I suppose it was that moment when I realized that information is incredibly valuable if you understand how to use it.
Mm. I have a friend of mine. He's out here. He's a local marketer, and he's actually doing the same concept of how we're teaching restaurants how they're take back their customer data. Third parties taking over their commission structure and whatnot. But more importantly, it's the customer data is what is the lost piece that the restaurant is not getting from that. And he works in the cannabis industry with these dispensaries that are out, and they pay. Oh man, he's doing 6 figures every month from his clients that are paying him to recapture that data from their third-party platforms that they pay tens of thousands of dollars for on a monthly basis to advertise their product. Yeah. And that industry, we're learning, from Edgar, and I wish I knew Spanish more so I can get, into deeper conversations with these people, but I get it from Edgar, and I see how these other businesses that are they're not really tech savvy and they don't really understand too much of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And it crosses over to that other industry as well, as the dispensary and the cannabis, because these people are just, you know, they know this is a newly legal, you know, business that come to Mountain, and, you know, the street game doesn't apply in a lot of what they're doing, and they're getting, you know, they're making a lot of money, but they don't know where it's going.
No, that's exactly right. And I have one of the guys I used to work with at this company that I've been talking about contacted me about 3 years ago. He still does this kind of merchandise planning stuff and inventory management as an independent consultant. And he said, you know, I'm going into the cannabis industry. I kind of went, oh, really? You know, and so we had coffee, and sure enough, he was convinced that this was going to explode, and he was right. And he noticed that the need was to help them understand what retail was about. And of course, he had spent his whole life in doing retail consulting. And so that's exactly what he got started with, is helping them to figure out how to record their information, how to break things into categories. And then he started building planning for that. And he did very well. And then he's gotten into several partnerships because, you know, he was going to the cannabis shows in Las Vegas back when they only had, you know, a couple of thousand people showing up. And now it's 20 or 30 or 100,000. I don't know, who knows how many, but I mean, it's an enormous industry and nobody recorded it. And of course, because of the banking problems, they have tons of cash. So they're dealing in cash. They had no way to record credit sales, no way to record just general information. They were dope heads, most of them, and they weren't thinking in terms of business in any way. All they realized is, wow, at the end of the day, I've got a whole bunch of cash in my pocket, and I'm going to keep doing this. That's kind of what he said, is that's what they're about. So it needs a whole lot, that industry needs a whole lot of help because they don't even act the way business people act. And now it's getting to the point to where there's a lot more competition, and a lot of real business people are getting into this business, and they're going to change the entire face of it. And those people who are just kind of wondering what happened will just sit around and scratch their head and never really figure it out and just say, gee, it's not the business it used to be. And that's because you know, it will mature at some point. In Colorado, it's, you know, the demand is there. Everybody who wants it has it. And there are plenty of stores all over the place. And, you know, the prices are dropping. And, you know, so all of a sudden, we're talking about a very, very crowded marketplace. And it's there for somebody to consolidate, just the way the tobacco companies consolidated and into 5 or 6 big ones. And the way the market always is, as we've studied the market, it's going to happen there too. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good discussion. Looks like we're just about out of time, and I appreciate you guys weighing in on some of these questions. I hope this was interesting, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. I'm going to send out a little questionnaire to everybody and see if you have some specific topics. We'll be having some additional guest speakers in and so forth. So now we've kind of gone through this marketing cycle thing. We'll open it up to a whole new batch of new subjects. So
Sounds good. Thank you, Ron. Always appreciate it.
yeah, you bet. Good to see you guys, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Likewise.
See ya.